Sometimes life breaks us so completely that we forget we're still worth loving. Sometimes it takes a stranger to remind us that our scars tell stories of survival, not shame. Bo Ransom learned this the hard way. He was once the richest, most handsome cowboy in 3 territories, but a barn fire left half his face scarred and his voice rough. Suddenly, nobody wanted him anymore. He locked himself away on his ranch while his fortune crumbled. Then came Maybeth, a seamstress with a limp and a gentle heart. She saw past his scars to his soul. Day after day, she returned, mending his shirts and his broken spirit. Their friendship grew into something deeper. But when Bo's greedy relative forces him into a marriage auction to save the ranch, will Maybeth find the courage to step forward? What happens when the woman who sees his worth must prove it to the world? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Hollow Creek, Texas, painting the weathered storefronts in shades of amber and gold. It was the kind of town where everybody knew everybody's business, where the church bells still rang twice on Sundays, and where the biggest excitement usually came from Old Pete's weekly poker game behind the general store. But 3 years ago, that peaceful rhythm had been shattered by an explosion that lit up the night sky for 20 miles in every direction. Bo Ransom's barn fire had been the talk of 3 territories, not just because of the spectacular flames that took half the night to extinguish, but because of what it did to the man who'd once been the pride of Hollow Creek. Before that terrible night, Bo had been everything a cowboy should be: tall, broad-shouldered, with a smile that could charm a rattlesnake, and pockets deep enough to buy half the county, if he'd wanted to. His family's ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime Texas grassland, and the Ransom name had been respected in these parts for 4 generations. The silver pocket watch in Bo's vest had belonged to his father, and his father's father before that. It was a fine piece, engraved with the family crest and worn smooth by decades of calloused hands. Bo used to pull it out during cattle drives, checking the time with the authority of a man who owned more land than most folks could ride across in a day. Now it sat silent in a drawer, its chain tarnished and its face cracked from the night. Everything changed. That night, Bo had been checking on a pregnant mare in the old barn when a lantern fell from its hook. The hay was dry from weeks without rain, and the flames spread faster than wildfire. He'd managed to save the mare, but not without cost. The burning timber that crashed down on him left the right side of his face scarred from temple to jaw, and smoke damage had roughened his once smooth voice to a harsh whisper. The doctor said he was lucky to be alive. The mirror in his bedroom suggested otherwise. The town had rallied around him at first, as small towns do. They'd brought casseroles and offers of help, spoken in hushed tones about his bravery in saving the horse. But as weeks turned to months and the bandages came off to reveal the extent of his injuries, the visits became fewer. The ladies who'd once competed for his attention suddenly found reasons to look away when they passed him on the street. Marriage proposals that had once arrived weekly stopped altogether. Bo had watched it all from behind the curtains of his ranch house, learning the hard lesson that beauty and wealth could disappear in a single night, but the loneliness that followed could last a lifetime. He dismissed his ranch hands, not out of pride but out of kindness. Why should they stay loyal to a man who couldn't bear to look at himself in the mirror? The cattle were sold off, the fields left fallow, and the once proud Ransom Ranch became a shadow of its former self. The house itself told the story of his decline. Paint peeled from the shutters, and the front porch sagged under the weight of neglect. Weeds had taken over the flower beds his mother had once tended with such care, and the windows stayed shuttered against the curious stares of passers-by. Inside, dust gathered on furniture that had once hosted the finest society gatherings in the county. The dining room table, built to seat 12, now served as a place to stack unopened mail and unanswered invitations to events Bo no longer attended. Meanwhile, On the other side of town, Mabeth Cullen was stitching another man's shirt in the back room of Henderson's dry goods. Her fingers moved with practiced precision across the fabric, each stitch neat, and even despite the tremor in her left hand, a remnant of the polio that had claimed her childhood and left her with a pronounced limp. She was 28 years old, with mousy brown hair that she kept pinned back in a practical bun, and eyes the color of sage-grass after rain. Pretty wasn't a word folks used to describe Mabeth, but there was something about her quiet strength that drew people in. She'd been working for old Mr. Henderson since she was 16, first as a shop girl and then as his seamstress, when her skill with needle and thread became apparent. The work suited her. It was precise, useful, and allowed her to support herself without depending on charity or pity. Her small apartment above the shop was modest, but clean, decorated with wildflowers. She picked on her walks and quilts she'd sewn from fabric scraps. Mabeth had a way with animals that bordered on magical. Horses would calm at her approach, and even the most skittish barn cat would purr when she scratched behind its ears. She talked to them like they were old friends, sharing her thoughts and troubles with creatures who listened without judgment. It was a habit that had started in childhood, when the other children avoided her because of her limp, and it had persisted into adulthood out of genuine affection for their simple honesty. The town had tried to match her with various bachelors over the years, but nothing had come of it. Some men were put off by her disability, others by her quiet nature and lack of conventional beauty. Mabeth had long ago made peace with the likelihood that she would remain unmarried, finding purpose in her work and contentment in her simple pleasures. She read voraciously, tended a small garden behind the shop, and maintained a correspondence with a cousin in San Antonio who sent her books and news from the wider world. But it was her kindness that truly set her apart. She mended clothes for families who couldn't afford new ones, often refusing payment. She sat with sick neighbors, brought soup to widows, and never once complained about her own circumstances. The town had learned to rely on her quiet generosity, even as they overlooked her when it came to romance and marriage. On this particular morning, Mr. Henderson had handed her a leather saddlebag with a torn strap, along with specific instructions. "This needs to go out to the ransom place," he'd said, his weathered face creased with concern. "Bo ordered it months ago, but I've been putting off the delivery. You just drop it at the door and come straight back, you hear? That man's not been right since the fire." Mabeth had nodded, wrapping the repaired saddlebag in brown paper and tucking it under her arm. The walk to the Ransom Ranch was a long one, especially with her uneven gait, but she welcomed the exercise and the chance to see the countryside. She'd heard the stories about Bo Ransom, of course, how he'd become a hermit, how his face was ruined, how he'd turned away visitors and refused all company. But she'd also heard about the mare he'd saved, and that act of courage had stuck with her. As she approached the ranch house, she could see the signs of neglect that had become legendary in town. The fence posts leaned at odd angles, the gate hung askew on its hinges, and the garden was a tangle of weeds and overgrown roses. But the bones of the place were still strong, and Mabeth could imagine how beautiful it must have been in its prime. The house itself was a grand, two-story structure with a wraparound porch, built from local stone and timber that had weathered to a silver grey. She climbed the front steps carefully, her bad leg making the ascent slower than she would have liked. The porch boards creaked under her weight, and she noticed that several of the railing spindles were broken. A man's boot print in the dust suggested that Bo still used this entrance, though probably not often. She raised her hand to knock, then paused, struck by the profound silence that surrounded the place. When the door finally opened, Mabeth found herself face to face with Bo Ransom for the first time. He was still a large man, broad-shouldered and tall, but there was a hollowness to him that spoke of weight lost and spirit diminished. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, and his clothes hung loose on his frame. But it was his face that held her attention, not the scars, which were indeed extensive, but the eyes above them. They were the deep blue of a winter sky, and they held a pain that went far deeper than any physical injury. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice rough and barely above a whisper. "Henderson should have sent one of the boys." Mabeth looked at him steadily, taking in the ruined right side of his face without flinching. The scars were deep and clearly painful, but they didn't define him any more than her limp defined her. "Mr. Henderson asked me to deliver this," she said simply, holding out the wrapped saddlebag. "But I couldn't help noticing your shirt's missing 3 buttons. I can fix that if you like." Bo stared at her for a long moment, clearly taken aback by her directness. Most people either stared at his scars or made a point of not looking at him at all. This woman did neither. She simply stood there, patient and unafraid, as if missing buttons were the most natural thing in the world to discuss. "I don't need," he began, then stopped. The truth was, he did need help, with almost everything. But accepting it meant admitting just how far he'd fallen, and pride was about all he had left. "Of course you don't," Mabeth agreed pleasantly. "But I'm quite good with a needle, and those buttons won't sew themselves back on. I'll just take a moment." Before he could protest further, she'd stepped past him into the house, moving with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to making herself useful. Bo found himself following her, too surprised to object. No one had been inside his house in over a year, and he was suddenly aware of how it must look to her, the dust, the clutter, the general air of abandonment that had settled over everything like a shroud. "You have a beautiful home," Mabeth said, and she meant it. Beneath the neglect, the house retained its inherent dignity. The high ceilings, the quality woodwork, the carefully chosen furniture, all of it, spoke of a family that had taken pride in their legacy. "My grandmother had a parlor clock like that one. Is it German?" Bo nodded, still trying to process the fact that she was here, in his house, talking about furniture as if nothing had changed. "My great-grandfather brought it from Munich," he managed to say. "The craftsmanship is remarkable," she continued, setting down the saddlebag and looking around with genuine appreciation. "This was a happy house once. I can feel it." Something in her tone made Bo's chest tighten. When was the last time anyone had spoken of his home with such warmth? When was the last time anyone had seen potential instead of decay? He watched as she moved through the room, her limp barely noticeable in the graceful way she carried herself, and felt something he'd thought was dead, forever, stir to life in his heart. "The buttons," he said suddenly, desperate to break the spell she seemed to be weaving around him. "You said you could fix them." Mabeth smiled, a gentle expression that transformed her plain face into something approaching beautiful. "I did indeed. If you have a needle and thread, I can have you looking proper again in no time." As she spoke, she was already assessing the damage to his shirt, not just the missing buttons, but the frayed cuffs, the small tear near the pocket, the general state of disrepair that spoke of a man who'd stopped caring about such things long ago. There was work to be done here, she realized, and not just on the clothing. "I should warn you," Bo said, his voice carrying a bitter edge. "I'm not much for company these days. People find me difficult to look at." Mabeth turned to face him fully, her sage green eyes meeting his without hesitation. "Mr. Ransom," she said quietly, "I've been looking at you since you opened that door, and I haven't seen anything difficult about it. Now, shall we find that needle and thread?" For the first time in 3 years, Bo Ransom found himself at a loss for words. This plain, limping seamstress had walked into his house and his life with the same quiet determination she brought to everything else, and somehow, inexplicably, he didn't want her to leave. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made everything seem possible. Mabeth had spent the previous evening mending Bo's shirt by lamplight, her fingers working carefully around the worn fabric while her mind replayed their conversation. She'd found his sewing kit in a kitchen drawer, the thread dusty and the needles rusted, but serviceable enough for her purposes. More than the missing buttons, she'd noticed the careful way he'd moved through his own house, like a guest unsure of his welcome. Now, with the repaired shirt wrapped in clean muslin and tucked into her basket, alongside fresh bread from the bakery, she made her way back to the Ransom Ranch. The morning walk gave her time to think about the man she'd met yesterday, not the scarred hermit of local legend, but the lonely soul she'd glimpsed behind his defensive walls. There had been intelligence in his eyes, and kindness too, buried beneath years of self-imposed isolation. The ranch looked different in the morning light, less forbidding somehow. She could see where flower beds had once bloomed alongside the front porch, and the skeletal remains of what must have been a beautiful garden. A few stubborn roses still climbed the trellis by the kitchen window, their blooms wild and unpruned, but determined to survive. It spoke to something resilient in the place, something that refused to surrender completely to neglect. Bo answered her knock more quickly this time, as if he'd been watching for her approach. He wore the same clothes as yesterday, and she noticed he hadn't bothered to shave. His eyes held a wariness that hadn't been there when she left, as if the night had reminded him of all the reasons to keep people at a distance. "You came back," he said, and there was surprise in his rough voice. "I told you I would," Mabeth replied simply. She held up the wrapped shirt. "And I always keep my word. May I come in?" He stepped aside without speaking, but she caught the faint nod of his head. The house smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and she noticed he'd made some effort to tidy the front room. The dust had been swept from the furniture, and the newspapers that had been scattered across every surface were now stacked neatly on a side table. "You've been busy," she observed, setting her basket on the hall table and unwrapping his shirt. The fabric looked renewed, the missing buttons restored, and the small tear by the pocket neatly mended. "I took the liberty of fixing a few other things while I had it. The cuff was coming loose, and there was a small rip you might not have noticed." Bo took the shirt with careful hands, examining her work with the eye of someone who appreciated craftsmanship. Each stitch was perfectly even, nearly invisible against the fabric. She'd matched the thread so precisely to the original color that he had to look closely to see where the repairs had been made. "This is fine work," he said quietly, "better than it was when I bought it. My grandmother always said that mending done with care could make something stronger than it was before." Mabeth reached into her basket and withdrew the fresh bread, still warm from the ovens. "I thought you might enjoy this. Mrs. Patterson at the bakery makes the best sourdough in the county." Bo stared at the offering, clearly struggling with something. "You don't have to. We can pay you for the shirt work, whatever Henderson charges for mending." "This isn't about payment, Mr. Ransom." Mabeth's voice was gentle but firm. "This is about neighbors helping neighbors, about doing what's right because it needs doing." He was quiet for a long moment, the bread cradled in his large hands like something precious. When he looked up, his blue eyes held a vulnerability that made her heart ache. "I don't remember how to do this," he admitted, "how to talk to people, how to be around them without—" He gestured vaguely at his scarred face. "Without feeling like they're judging you?" Mabeth finished. When he nodded, she settled herself on the edge of a chair, her movements careful but comfortable. "I understand that feeling. I've lived with it most of my life." "That's different. Your condition, it doesn't change how people see you." "Not really." Mabeth laughed, but there was no bitterness in the sound. "Oh, Mr. Ransom, I think you'd be surprised. I've watched people's eyes shift away when I walk into a room. I've heard the whispers about poor Mabeth and her affliction. I've seen mothers pull their children aside when I pass, as if whatever I have might be catching." Bo studied her face, seeing for the first time the quiet strength it had taken for her to build a life in a world that often turned away from imperfection. "But you still go out, still talk to people, because the alternative is what you've been doing these past 3 years, she said matter-of-factly, "hiding away, letting fear make your choices for you, and that's no way to live." The words hit him like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He'd been existing, not living, marking time in a house that had become more prison than home. "It's not that simple," he said. "You don't understand what it's like to have people stare at you like you're some kind of monster." "You're right," Mabeth agreed. "I don't know what that specific pain feels like, but I know what it's like to feel different, to feel like you don't belong in your own skin. And I know that the longer you stay hidden, the harder it becomes to step back into the light." She rose from her chair, moving to the window that looked out over the overgrown garden. "This place could be beautiful again, you know. It wouldn't take much, just someone willing to see past the weeds to what's growing underneath." Bo joined her at the window, following her gaze to the tangle of roses and wildflowers that had taken over the formal beds. "My mother planted those roses," he said they'd outlast all of us if we just gave them a chance. She was a wise woman. Roses are survivors. They'll bloom through almost anything if their roots are strong. Mabeth turned to face him, her expression serious but kind. Just like people. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching a cardinal land among the thorny canes. The bird's red feathers were brilliant against the green backdrop, a splash of color that seemed to promise renewal. "I should probably get back to town," Mabeth said finally. "Mr. Henderson will be wondering where I've gotten to." "But," she hesitated, then forged ahead with characteristic directness. "I noticed your kitchen window has a loose pane. If you have some putty and a glazing tool, I could fix that when I bring your laundry back." "My laundry?" She gestured toward the basket she'd brought. "I took the liberty of gathering up what looked like it needed washing. A man should have clean clothes, don't you think?" Bo stared at her, this plain woman with the gentle eyes, who'd somehow made herself indispensable in the space of 2 days. "You don't have to do this. Any of this." "I know I don't have to," Mabeth replied. "I want to. There's a difference." As she prepared to leave, gathering her empty basket and adjusting her shawl, Bo found himself reluctant to see her go. The house would feel even emptier once she left, the silence more profound for having been broken. "Mabeth," he said as she reached the door. She turned back, eyebrows raised in question. "Thank you, for the shirt, for everything." She smiled that gentle smile that transformed her entire face. "You're welcome, Mr. Ransom. I'll see you tomorrow." After she left, Bo stood at the window, watching her small figure make its way down the dusty road toward town. She walked with purpose despite her limp, her head held high and her shoulders straight. There was something indomitable about her, something that refused to be diminished by circumstance or the opinions of others. He looked down at the fresh bread in his hands, still faintly warm and fragrant with yeast and grain. When was the last time someone had brought him food made with care? When was the last time anyone had seen him as worth the effort? For the first time in 3 years, Bo Ransom felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. It was a small thing, fragile as a newborn colt, but it was there. And tomorrow, Mabeth would return with his clean laundry and her quiet companionship, and perhaps this feeling would grow a little stronger. The hand-sewn shirt hung over the back of his chair, its careful stitches catching the morning light. It was more than clothing, no, it was proof that broken things could be mended, that someone cared enough to take the time to make them whole again. He thought about what she'd said, about roses surviving if their roots were strong. Perhaps it was time to find out if his own roots had weathered the storm that had tried to destroy him. Perhaps it was time to let someone help him bloom again. 3 weeks had passed since Mabeth first knocked on Bo's door, and the rhythm of her daily visits had become as natural as breathing. She arrived each morning after breakfast, usually carrying something: clean laundry, fresh bread, herbs from her garden, or simply her sewing basket, and whatever small repair the ranch house needed that day. Bo had stopped protesting her help, though he still struggled to understand why she kept coming back. Today she found him on the front porch, attempting to repair a broken railing spindle with tools that looked older than he was. His movements were careful but unpracticed, and she could see the frustration building in the set of his shoulders as the wood refused to cooperate. "That piece is split along the grain," she observed, settling her basket on the porch steps. "You'll need to replace it entirely rather than trying to mend it." Bo looked up from his work, a smudge of sawdust across his forehead. "I figured that much out," he said, but there was no irritation in his voice. "Problem is, I'm not much of a carpenter, never had to be before." Before. The word hung between them like it always did when Bo referenced his old life. Mabeth had learned not to push too hard when he approached those memories, but to listen when he chose to share them. "My father was handy with tools," she said, pulling a few items from her basket. "He taught me the basics before the polio got bad. Sometimes a woman has to know how to fix things herself." She produced a small saw and a measuring tape, tools that looked well used but carefully maintained. Bo watched with growing interest as she examined the broken spindle, taking measurements and testing the grain of the wood. "The lumber yard in town will cut you a replacement if you give them the specifications," she said. "But first, we should check the others. If one's failing, there might be more ready to give way." They spent the next hour examining the porch railings, finding 2 more spindles that were cracked and several that were loose in their sockets. It was methodical work, but Bo found himself relaxing into it. There was something soothing about having a clear problem with a clear solution, and Mabeth's quiet competence made him feel less foolish about his own inexperience. "You know," he said as they worked, "I used to have a crew of men who handled all this. Figured that's what money was for, paying someone else to worry about the details. And now—" Bo was quiet for a moment, testing a loose post. "Now I'm learning that money can disappear a lot faster than you earn it. And the men you pay to care don't always stick around when things get difficult." It was the most he'd ever said about his current circumstances, and Mabeth filed the information away carefully. She'd suspected the ranch was in financial trouble. The signs were obvious to anyone who knew how to look, but Bo's pride had kept him from admitting it directly. "Good help is hard to find," she agreed, "but there's satisfaction in doing things yourself, too, in knowing every inch of a place because you've worked on it with your own hands." As if summoned by their conversation, a horse's whinny carried across the yard from the direction of the barn. Bo's head came up sharply, and Mabeth saw something flicker across his face, concern, mixed with what might have been guilt. "I should check on her," he said, already moving toward the sound. "She's been restless lately." Mabeth followed him across the yard to the barn, noting the way his pace quickened with each step. Inside, she found a sight that broke her heart and filled it simultaneously. A beautiful chestnut mare stood in a large stall, her coat gleaming, despite the general disrepair of the building around her. But it was the way Bo approached her that caught Mabeth's attention with infinite gentleness, speaking in the soft tones of someone who understood that animals, like people, could be wounded by careless words. "Easy, Bell girl," he murmured, running his hands along the mare's neck. "What's got you worked up today?" The horse calmed immediately at his touch, nuzzling against his shoulder with obvious affection. Mabeth could see the bond between them, deep and unbreakable, forged in shared trauma and mutual salvation. "She's beautiful," Mabeth said quietly. "Is this the mare you saved from the fire?" Bo nodded, his fingers finding a favorite spot behind Bell's ears. "She was ready to foal that night. If I hadn't gotten her out—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. "She lost the colt anyway, from the stress, but she lived." Mabeth moved closer, letting Bell catch her scent before extending her hand for the mare to investigate. To Bo's surprise, the horse accepted her immediately, allowing Mabeth to stroke her muzzle with the same gentle confidence she brought to everything else. "You saved each other," Mabeth observed. "She gave you a reason to go into that burning barn, and you gave her a reason to keep fighting." Something like that. Bo's voice was rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "She's about all I have left that's worth keeping." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Mabeth continued stroking Bell's neck, but her eyes were on Bo, seeing the pain he carried like a physical weight. "She's not all you have," she said quietly. "You still have this place, these hands that can learn to fix what's broken, a mind that can solve problems, and a heart that's capable of great love. I've seen how you are with her." Bo started to shake his head, but Mabeth pressed on. "And you have music. I noticed the piano in your front room. The keys are dusty, but the instrument looks well made." "I haven't played in years," Bo said quickly. "Not since." "Since the fire changed your voice?" Mabeth finished gently. "Music isn't just about singing, Mr. Ransom. Some of the most beautiful songs are played, not sung." She moved away from Bell to examine the piano more closely. It was indeed a fine instrument, a baby grand that must have cost a small fortune when it was new. The wood was still rich and dark, though it needed polishing, and when she pressed one of the keys, the note rang clear and true. "My mother played," Bo said, joining her at the bench. "She taught me when I was young, said every gentleman should know how to make music. I used to play for her in the evenings, after the ranch work was done." What was her favorite song? Beau's fingers moved unconsciously over the keys, not quite pressing them, but remembering their positions. An old ballad about a cowboy and his sweetheart. She said it reminded her of how she met my father. Would you play it for me? The request caught him off guard. He looked at his hands, calloused and scarred from years of ranch work and recent amateur repairs. I'm not sure I remember how. It's been so long. Muscle memory is a powerful thing, Mabeth said, and music has a way of living in our hearts even when our minds try to forget it. Slowly, tentatively, Beau placed his fingers on the keys. The first few notes were hesitant, uncertain, but as the melody began to emerge, his confidence grew. The song was simple and sweet, the kind of tune that spoke of simpler times and enduring love. His hands remembered what his mind had tried to put aside, and soon the music filled the room with warmth that had been absent for too long. When the last note faded away, Beau sat staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. I'd forgotten, he said softly, how it felt to make something beautiful. Beauty doesn't require perfection, Mabeth said. Sometimes the most beautiful things are the ones that come from a place of healing, of hope choosing to bloom again despite the darkness that tried to kill it. For the first time since she'd known him, Beau turned to look at her directly, both sides of his face visible in the afternoon light streaming through the windows. Why do you keep coming here, Mabeth? Why do you care what happens to me? She considered the question seriously, knowing it deserved an honest answer. Because everyone deserves to be seen for who they truly are, not just what the world has done to them. Because kindness should be given freely, without expectation of return, and because, she paused, gathering courage for the complete truth. Because when I look at you, I don't see a broken man. I see someone who's survived something terrible and is still capable of gentleness. That's not weakness, Mr. Ransom. That's strength. Outside, Belle whinnied again, but this time the sound was content, peaceful. The afternoon sun slanted through the barn windows, painting everything in golden light, and for a moment the world felt full of possibility instead of loss. I should get back to town, Mabeth said finally, though she was reluctant to break the spell of the afternoon. But tomorrow I'll bring that putty for the window, and maybe you could play another song? Beau nodded, something loosening in his chest that had been tight for years. I'd like that, he said, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in a long time. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave, Mabeth paused at the barn door. Mr. Ransom, the cracked piano key, the one that sticks when you play F-sharp? That can be fixed too. Everything can be fixed, if you're patient enough and willing to put in the work. After she left, Beau sat at the piano for a long time, playing the old songs his mother had loved and thinking about second chances. The cracked key caught under his finger just as Mabeth had said it would, but even broken, it still made music. Maybe that was enough to start with, maybe that was enough to build on. The leather saddle hung in the tack room like a monument to better days. Hand-tooled with intricate designs that spoke of master craftsmanship, it had been Beau's prized possession before the fire, the saddle he'd ridden to victory in more rodeos than he could count. Now it gathered dust alongside bridles that hadn't seen use in years, and spurs that no longer rang with the music of a working ranch. Mabeth discovered it on a morning when Beau had finally allowed her to help him tackle the neglected barn. They'd been working in comfortable silence, sorting through years of accumulated clutter, when she pushed aside a moth-eaten horse blanket and found the saddle underneath. This is beautiful work, she said, running her fingers along the detailed leather carving. Even in the dim light of the tack room, the quality was unmistakable. Is this silver on the horn? Beau looked up from the harness he'd been examining, and his face went carefully blank when he saw what she'd found. It was a championship saddle, he said quietly, from the San Antonio Rodeo, 5 years running. You were a rodeo cowboy? There was no surprise in her voice, only interest. Somehow it fit with everything else she'd learned about him, the easy way he moved around horses, the confidence that still showed through despite his current circumstances. Among other things, Beau set down the harness and moved closer, his eyes fixed on the saddle with an expression Mabeth couldn't quite read. Bronc riding, mostly. Some bull riding when I was young and stupid enough to think I was invincible. What changed? Bo was quiet for a long moment, his hand hovering just above the saddle's pommel without quite touching it. My father got sick, cancer. I came home to help run the ranch and just never left again. The circuit was a young man's game anyway, and I had responsibilities here. Mabeth heard the weight of those responsibilities in his voice, the way a man's dreams could be set aside for duty and never quite picked up again. Do you miss it? The competition? The traveling? I thought I didn't. Bo finally touched the saddle, his fingers tracing the familiar curves. But standing here now, looking at this, I remember how it felt to ride. Not just sitting on a horse, but really riding, when you and the animal become one thing, moving together across the ground. You could still ride, Mabeth said gently. Belle would probably enjoy getting out of that stall for more than just exercise in the paddock. Bo shook his head. Look at me, Mabeth. I can barely handle my own reflection in the mirror. You think I could sit a horse again, knowing what I look like, knowing what people would say? I think, Mabeth said carefully, that Belle doesn't care what you look like, and I think there's more open country on this ranch than there are people to judge you. She moved to examine a set of bridles hanging on the wall, giving him space to process her words. The leather was cracked from neglect and would need significant work to be usable again, but the basic structure was sound. Like so many things in Bo's life, she realized damaged, but not beyond saving. Tell me about the polio, Bo said suddenly. How old were you when it happened? The question caught her off guard. In all their conversations, he'd never asked directly about her condition, though she'd seen him watching the way she moved, noting the careful placement of her left foot and the slight tremor in her hand. 7, she said, not looking away from the bridles. It was the summer of 1867. The epidemic hit Hollow Creek hard that 12 children fell sick and 3 didn't survive. I was one of the lucky ones, my mother said. Lucky, the word carried a bitter edge. Strange how we use that word for things that change our lives forever. Mabeth turned to face him, leaning against the wall for support. I used to be angry about it, especially when I was younger and watched other children run and play while I struggled just to walk across a room. But anger is a heavy thing to carry, and eventually I got tired of the weight. So you just decided not to be angry anymore? Not exactly. She smiled, though there was sadness in it. I decided that being different wasn't the same as being less, that my worth wasn't measured by how fast I could run or how straight I could walk. It took years to truly believe it, but once I did, everything else became easier. Bo studied her face, seeing the hard-won peace there. Your family, how did they handle it? My parents were wonderful, Mabeth said. They never treated me like I was fragile or pitiful. My father especially, he was the one who taught me that having limitations didn't mean accepting defeat. He'd say, Mabeth, you find another way around the mountain, but you don't stop climbing. He sounds like a wise man. He was. I lost him when I was 20, and my mother 2 years later. But they gave me something that can't be taken away, the knowledge that I'm capable of more than people might expect. Bo was quiet, absorbing this. In all his self-pity and isolation, he'd never considered that Mabeth might understand his struggles better than anyone. She'd faced her own version of being stared at, pitied, written off by people who couldn't see past the surface. I've been thinking, Mabeth said, moving to another section of the tack room, about what you said regarding the ranch hands you let go. Do you ever consider bringing any of them back? Can't afford to pay them, Bo admitted. Haven't been able to for over a year now. The cattle are gone, the fields lie fallow, there's not enough income to support a payroll. But there are other ways to structure employment. Sharecropping arrangements, partnerships based on future profits. Men who worked for your family for years might be willing to invest in the ranch's recovery if they believed in its future. Bo looked at her sharply. You've been thinking about this a lot. I care about what happens to you, she said simply, and I can see the potential here, even if you can't right now. This land is good, Bo. The bloodline Belle represents has value. The infrastructure is solid, just needs attention and investment. Investment I don't have. Money isn't the only form of investment, Mabeth pointed out. There's sweat equity, knowledge, connections. Your name still means something in this county, even if you don't believe it anymore. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, sorting through years of accumulation. Mabeth found herself cataloguing what could be salvaged, what needed repair, what might be sold to generate some immediate income. She was naturally practical, and her mind automatically organized problems into manageable pieces. "Mabeth," Bo said eventually, "can I ask you something personal?" She looked up from a box of horseshoes she'd been examining. "Of course. Have you ever, that is, has anyone ever?" He struggled with the words, his scarred face flushing with embarrassment. "Asked to court me?" She finished gently. When he nodded, she set down the horseshoe she'd been holding. "A few times, yes. Nothing that lasted long." "Why not?" She considered how to answer honestly without sounding bitter. "Various reasons. Some men were put off by my disability, others by my lack of conventional beauty. A few seemed to think I should be grateful for any attention at all, which told me more about them than I cared to know." "Their loss," Bo said quietly. Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. "What about you? Before the fire, I mean. You must have had many suitors interested in the eligible bachelor of Hollow Creek." Bo's laugh was harsh. "Oh, I had plenty of interest. Women who saw the ranch, the money, the prospects. But looking back, I'm not sure how many of them saw me. The real me, not just what I represented. And after the fire? After the fire, I learned how shallow most of those attachments really were." He picked up the championship saddle, testing its weight. "Amazing how quickly people can disappear when you're no longer useful to them." Mabeth moved closer, studying his profile as he examined the saddle. "Their leaving says nothing about your worth, Bo. It says everything about their character." "Does it?" He set the saddle down and turned to face her fully. "Or does it say that I was fooling myself all along about what I had to offer?" "You saved Belle's life," Mabeth said firmly. "You've maintained this ranch as best you could under impossible circumstances. You've shown me nothing but kindness and respect from the moment we met. You have gentle hands and a heart capable of great love. If people can't see that, the problem isn't with you." The intensity in her voice surprised them both. For a moment, they stood facing each other in the dusty tack room, something unspoken passing between them. Bo reached out as if to touch her face, then caught himself and pulled his hand back. "I should get this saddle cleaned up," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Maybe take Belle out for a proper ride, like you suggested." "I think that's a wonderful idea," Mabeth agreed, though her heart was beating faster than the conversation warranted. "And Bo, when you do ride out, remember that the most beautiful things happen when no one else is watching. That's when we're most truly ourselves." As they finished their work in the tack room, both of them were acutely aware of how their hands would accidentally brush when reaching for the same item, how their eyes would meet and hold for just a moment longer than necessary. Something was growing between them, delicate as spring grass, but persistent as the roses that climbed the kitchen window. Neither was quite ready to name it yet, but it was there nonetheless in the way Bo's voice softened when he spoke to her, in the way Mabeth found reasons to touch his arm when making a point, in the comfortable silences that spoke of understanding deeper than words. The championship saddle sat cleaned and oiled on its rack, ready for the day when its owner would find the courage to reclaim not just his skill, but his sense of himself as a man worthy of respect and perhaps even love. The deed to the Ransom Ranch lay spread across Bo's kitchen table like a death sentence, its legal language dense with clauses and contingencies that had seemed merely formal when his grandfather had drawn up the family trust decades earlier. Now, as Jeremiah Ransom's shadow fell across the yellowed pages, those same clauses threatened to destroy everything 4 generations of Ransoms had built. "You see here, cousin," Jeremiah said, his manicured finger tracing a particular paragraph. "Section 12, subsection C, In the event that the ranch fails to maintain profitable operations for a period exceeding 3 consecutive years, or if the primary heir fails to produce issue to continue the family line, the property shall revert to the surviving male heir of the Ransom bloodline. Bo studied his cousin's face, seeing the satisfaction there that Jeremiah couldn't quite hide behind his show of reluctant duty. Jeremiah had always resented that Bo's branch of the family had inherited the main ranch while his father had received only a smaller spread and a modest inheritance. Now, with oil discovered on the northern section of Ransom land, that resentment had crystallized into something harder and more calculating. "The ranch isn't profitable because I chose to let it rest," Bo said carefully. "That doesn't mean it can't be profitable again." "Chose to let it rest?" Jeremiah's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "Brother, you've sold off the cattle, dismissed the hands, and let the best grazing land go to seed. By any legal definition, this operation has failed." Mabeth, who had been quietly mending a curtain in the corner, set down her needle and thread. She'd been coming to the ranch for 2 months now, and Bo had finally stopped trying to send her away when visitors arrived. Her presence had become as natural as breathing, and he found he needed her steady calm more than his pride required her absence. "Mr. Jeremiah," she said politely, "perhaps you could explain the time frame involved in this clause. When exactly would such a provision take effect?" Jeremiah's gaze shifted to her with barely concealed irritation. He'd heard about the seamstress who'd been hanging around his cousin, but he'd assumed she was merely another of the desperate women who sometimes tried to catch a wealthy man in his weakness. Seeing her actually participate in family business annoyed him. "Miss Cullen, isn't it? This is really a family matter." "Mabeth is welcome to hear anything you have to say to me," Bo said firmly. "In fact, I'd prefer she stay." Something in his tone warned Jeremiah not to push the issue. "Very well. The clause requires either return to profitability or," he paused meaningfully, "marriage and the prospect of heirs within 5 years of the ranch ceasing operations. That deadline is next month." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Bo felt the familiar weight of trapped helplessness settle over him, the same feeling that had driven him to isolation in the first place. How could he marry when no woman would have him? How could he father children when he couldn't even look at himself in the mirror without flinching? "Of course," Jeremiah continued smoothly, "I'm prepared to offer a reasonable solution. I'll buy your portion of the ranch at current market value, which, given its condition, is substantially less than it was worth before your troubles, but still enough to set you up comfortably elsewhere. This land has been in our family for 4 generations, Bo said quietly, and it could continue to be, just under different management. I have the capital to restore it to profitability, the connections to secure the contracts needed for the cattle business, and Jeremiah's smile turned predatory. The social standing to make this ranch what it once was. The insult was delicately delivered but unmistakable. Mabeth's hands stilled on her mending, and she felt a flash of anger so sharp it surprised her. How dare this polished man sit in Bo's kitchen and suggest that his scars made him unfit to run his own family's legacy? Of course, Jeremiah added, there is the marriage option, though I confess I'm not sure how realistic that is, given the circumstances. Bo's face went carefully blank, the expression Mabeth had learned to recognize as his way of hiding pain too deep for words. No, he said quietly, I don't suppose it is realistic. Actually, Mabeth said, her voice cutting through the tension with surprising firmness, I think you might be mistaken about that. Both men turned to look at her, Jeremiah with annoyance, and Bo with something that might have been warning. But Mabeth had spent 2 months watching Bo retreat into himself every time someone suggested he was less than he'd been before, and she'd had enough. There are plenty of women in this county who would consider themselves fortunate to marry a man of Mr. Ransom's character, she continued, setting her mending aside and rising to her feet. A man who risked his life to save an animal, who treats everyone with respect regardless of their station, who has the strength to endure hardship without becoming bitter or cruel. Miss Cullen, Jeremiah's voice carried a patronizing edge. I'm sure your loyalty to my cousin is admirable, but we must be realistic about his prospects. The fire changed more than just his appearance, it changed his position in society. His position in society, Mabeth repeated, and there was steel in her voice now. You mean his position among people shallow enough to judge a man's worth by his face rather than his heart? Bo stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Mabeth, please, there's no need to— There's every need, she interrupted, turning to face him with fierce determination. You've let people like him convince you that you're somehow less than you were, but it's not true. The fire took your old life, yes, but it didn't take your value as a man. Jeremiah watched this exchange with growing interest, his legal mind already calculating angles. Miss Cullen, you seem remarkably invested in my cousin's welfare. Perhaps you'd be interested in helping him solve his current predicament. The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Mabeth felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized what he was implying, and worse, that part of her leaped at the possibility before her practical mind could intervene. I'm not sure what you're suggesting, she said carefully. A marriage of convenience, Jeremiah said smoothly. It would satisfy the terms of the trust, allow Bo to maintain ownership of the ranch, and provide you with a security and position you might not otherwise achieve. The words hit Mabeth like physical blows. A marriage of convenience. Security she might not otherwise achieve, as if her only value lay in being useful to a man who needed a wife in name only. That's enough, Bo said, his voice rougher than usual. Jeremiah, I think it's time for you to leave. I'm only trying to present all the options. Jeremiah protested, though his tone suggested he was enjoying the discomfort he'd created. The trust requires marriage, not love, surely a practical arrangement. Get out. Bo's words were quiet, but carried the authority of a man who'd reached the end of his patience. Now. Jeremiah gathered his papers with deliberate slowness, his message delivered. I'll need an answer within the month, Bo. The oil survey on the north section is scheduled for August, and I'd prefer to have ownership settled before then. Oil. The word explained everything. Jeremiah's sudden interest in enforcing obscure trust clauses, his urgency about the timeline, his confidence that Bo would eventually have no choice but to sell. The ranch wasn't just about family legacy anymore. It was about mineral rights that could be worth a fortune. After Jeremiah left, the kitchen felt hollow and cold, despite the afternoon sun streaming through the windows. Bo stood at the sink with his back to Mabeth, his shoulders rigid with tension and something that might have been shame. Bo, Mabeth said gently, what he suggested was insulting to both of us, Bo finished. I'm sorry you had to hear that. Sorry he spoke to you that way. That's not what I was going to say. Mabeth moved closer, her heart beating fast with the courage she was trying to summon. I was going to say that maybe it's not such a terrible idea. Bo turned to face her, his expression shocked. Mabeth, you can't be serious. A marriage of convenience. You deserve so much more than that. Do I? The question came out more bitter than she'd intended. I'm 28 years old, Bo. I limp, I'm plain, and I have no prospects for marriage beyond what your cousin just described. At least this way, I'd be useful to someone I care about. Someone you care about? Bo's voice was barely a whisper. Mabeth felt tears prick at her eyes, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. Did you think I've been coming here every day for 2 months out of Christian charity? Did you think I've been mending your clothes and fixing your house because I had nothing better to do with my time? The silence stretched between them, filled with everything they'd been too careful to say. Bo's blue eyes searched her face, as if seeing her clearly for the first time, taking in the determination there, the vulnerability she was trying so hard to hide. You care about me, he said, and it wasn't quite a question. More than I should, Mabeth admitted. More than is probably wise, given our circumstances. Bo moved closer, his scarred hand reaching up to touch her cheek with infinite gentleness. Mabeth, He stopped, struggling with words that felt too large for his damaged voice. You're not plain. You're not unmarriageable. You're the most beautiful woman I've ever known, and not because of how you look, because of who you are. "Then why won't you consider it?" she asked, leaning into his touch, despite the pain she heard in his voice. "Why won't you let me help you save this place?" "Because you deserve to be loved," Bo said simply. "Not just useful, not just convenient. Loved completely, passionately, by a man who can give you everything you deserve. And his voice broke slightly, I don't know if I'm capable of that anymore." Mabeth covered his hand with her own, pressing it more firmly against her cheek. "What if I told you that I already feel loved when I'm with you? What if I said that these past 2 months have been the happiest of my life, not because of what we might become, but because of what we already are?" The deed to the ranch lay forgotten on the table between them, its legal constraints suddenly seeming less important than the human connection that had grown quietly but surely in this kitchen, in this house, between two people who'd learned that love didn't require perfection, only courage enough to reach for it, despite their fears. The faded love letter lay hidden beneath a stack of ranch accounts in Bo's desk drawer, its edges yellowed with age, and its words a reminder of promises broken and hearts carelessly discarded. Mabeth discovered it by accident, 3 days after Jeremiah's visit, while helping Bo organize his father's old papers. She'd been looking for the original survey maps when her fingers brushed against the familiar texture of personal correspondence. "My dearest Bo," the letter began in flowery script, "your last letter filled my heart with such joy. To think that soon we shall be husband and wife, united in love and purpose for all our days to come. I confess I can hardly contain my excitement about our future together, the grand parties we shall host, the travels we shall take, the beautiful children who will inherit your strength and my grace." Mabeth set the letter down without reading further, her heart aching for the man who'd kept this reminder of betrayal. She could imagine what had happened after the fire, how quickly united in love and purpose had become empty words, when the writer realized her handsome fiancé would never again be the social asset she'd counted on. "You shouldn't have seen that," Bo said quietly from the doorway. He'd come looking for her after finishing his work with Belle, and the sight of the letter in her hands brought back memories he'd tried hard to bury. "I'm sorry," Mabeth said, carefully placing the letter back where she'd found it. "I was looking for the survey maps, and I didn't mean to pry." "Her name was Cordelia Manning," Bo said, moving into the room but keeping his distance from the desk. "We were engaged before the fire. Had the wedding planned for the fall, the church reserved, her dress ordered from New Orleans." Mabeth waited, sensing there was more he needed to say. "She came to see me once, after the bandages came off," Bo continued, his voice rough with old pain. "Sat in the parlor making polite conversation for exactly 15 minutes, then explained very gently that she felt our circumstances had changed too dramatically for the engagement to continue. Said she was sure I'd understand." "And did you understand?" Bo's laugh was bitter. "I understood that everything I thought I'd known about love was built on sand. That a woman could claim to adore you, plan a future with you, promise to love you in sickness and in health, and then walk away the moment you became inconvenient." Mabeth felt anger rise in her chest, not at Bo, but at the shallow woman who'd wounded him so deeply. "She was a fool," she said quietly, "and she broke something in you that had nothing to do with the fire. Maybe she just saw reality more clearly than I did," Bo said, finally moving to the desk to close the drawer firmly. "Maybe she understood that some things, once broken, can't be fixed." "Is that what you really believe?" Mabeth turned to face him fully, her sage green eyes holding his without flinching. "That you're broken beyond fixing?" Before Bo could answer, the sound of piano music drifted in from the front room, not the hesitant notes he'd been playing lately, but something fuller, more confident. They looked at each other in confusion before realizing the music was coming from outside. They found the source on the front porch. Tom Henderson, the dry goods store owner's son, had brought his portable harmonium and was enthusiastically playing what sounded like a hymn. Behind him stood a small crowd from town. Mrs. Patterson from the bakery, the Whitmore twins, old Pete with his ever-present pipe, and several other familiar faces. "What's all this?" Bo asked, his voice wary. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her flour-dusted apron, a testament to the fresh bread she'd clearly brought for the occasion. "We heard about your troubles, Mr. Ransom. About the ranch and well, about the deadline your cousin mentioned." Beau's face darkened. "If this is some kind of charity—" "It's not charity," Tom Henderson interrupted, setting down his harmonium. "It's neighbors helping neighbors. There's talk in town about a solution to your problem, and we wanted you to know you have support." Mabeth felt her stomach drop. The town's gossip network was legendarily efficient, and if word had spread about Jeremiah's visit, then people would be speculating about everything, including the marriage suggestion. "What kind of support?" Mabeth asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Mrs. Patterson beamed at her with the kind of enthusiasm that made Mabeth deeply nervous. "Well, dear, we've been talking, and we all agree that you and Mr. Ransom would make a fine match. You've been practically taking care of him already, and he clearly values your company. It would solve both your problems," added Susanna Whitmore, one of the twins. "He needs a wife to keep the ranch, and you need a husband to secure your future." The casual cruelty of the statement took Mabeth's breath away. "Need a husband to secure your future," as if she were damaged goods lucky to find any taker, as if her value began and ended with her usefulness to a man in desperate circumstances. "I appreciate your concern," Beau said, his voice carefully controlled, "but Miss Cullen and I are perfectly capable of managing our own affairs." "Of course you are," old Pete said, tamping down his pipe tobacco. "But there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered freely. The whole town's pulling for you both." "Pulling for us both to what?" Mabeth asked, finding her voice again. "To get married, of course." Mrs. Patterson clapped her hands together, as if the matter were already settled. "It's so romantic, the scarred hero and the gentle seamstress finding love in adversity. Why, it's like something out of a storybook." Mabeth felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Mrs. Patterson, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "Oh, there's no need to be shy about it, dear. We've all seen how devoted you've been, coming out here every day, taking such good care of him. And Mr. Ransom, the way you look at her when you think no one's watching, well, it's clear to everyone that you care for each other." Beau's face had gone carefully blank again, that protective mask he wore when emotions threatened to overwhelm him. Mabeth could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands had clenched into fists at his sides. "The timing works out perfectly too," Tom Henderson added. "If you married before the deadline, Mr. Ransom could keep the ranch, and Miss Cullen would have the security and position she deserves." There it was, again the assumption that marriage to Beau would be a step up for her, a kindness extended to a woman with limited options. As if the idea that she might genuinely care for him, that he might care for her in return, was too far-fetched to consider. "I think," Mabeth said quietly, "you should all go home now." The group exchanged glances, clearly taken aback by her tone. Mrs. Patterson's smile faltered. "But dear, we're only trying to help." "Help with what exactly?" Mabeth's voice was steadier now, though anger simmered beneath the surface. "Help us realize that a marriage between the town's crippled spinster and the scarred hermit would be a practical arrangement that serves everyone's interests. Help us understand that we should be grateful for whatever companionship we can find, since neither of us is likely to do better." The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Patterson's face had gone pale, and even Tom Henderson had stopped fiddling with his harmonium. "That's not what we meant," Susanna Whitmore said weakly. "Isn't it?" Mabeth moved to stand beside Beau, not touching him but close enough to present a united front. "Because that's what I heard. I heard a group of people who've decided that two damaged people should settle for each other rather than hope for something real." "Mabeth," Beau said quietly, but she pressed on. "Mr. Ransom is not a charity case requiring rescue through marriage. He's a good man who deserves to be loved for who he is, not pitied into a convenient arrangement. And her voice caught slightly, but she forced herself to continue. "I deserve the same consideration as any other woman in this town, not to be treated like damaged goods, lucky to find any buyer." The crowd began to disperse, murmuring uncomfortable apologies and promises to mind their own business. Mrs. Patterson lingered longest, clearly wanting to repair the damage her well-meaning interference had caused, but Mabeth's expression warned her away. When they were finally alone, Bo and Mabeth stood on the porch in painful silence. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees, painting everything in golden light, but the beauty of the moment felt tainted by the conversation they'd just endured. "I'm sorry," Bo said finally. "I'm sorry they spoke to you that way. Sorry they made assumptions about us, about what we might mean to each other." "Are they wrong, though?" Mabeth asked, not looking at him. "Are we just two lonely people settling for whatever companionship we can find?" Bo turned to face her, his scarred features etched with pain and something deeper longing he'd tried so hard to hide. "Is that what you think? That you're settling for me?" The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Mabeth thought about the past 2 months, about the way her heart had learned to anticipate their daily conversations, about how his rare smiles had become more precious to her than anything she'd ever owned. "No," she said quietly, "but I need to know, when you look at me, do you see the woman the town sees? The plain, limping seamstress who should be grateful for any man's attention? Or do you see someone worth loving for herself?" Bo moved closer, his large hands reaching up to frame her face with infinite gentleness. "I see the woman who brought light back into this house when I'd forgotten what it looked like. I see someone brave enough to push past my walls, kind enough to see worth where others see only damage. I see," his voice broke slightly, "I see the woman I've fallen in love with, despite every reason I had to keep my heart locked away." The words hung in the air between them, finally spoken, finally real. Mabeth felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were tears of relief rather than sorrow. "I love you too," she whispered, "not because you need saving, not because I need security, but because you're the kindest, strongest, most honorable man I've ever known. And if the town can't see that, then the town is blind." As Bo leaned down to kiss her for the first time, the faded love letter in his desk drawer seemed like a relic from another man's life, reminder not of love lost, but of the difference between shallow promises and the kind of devotion that grew stronger in the face of adversity. This was what real love looked like, not perfect people finding each other, but wounded souls choosing to heal together. The marriage auction announcement appeared on the town bulletin board on a Thursday morning like a declaration of war, its bold black letters stark against the white paper that fluttered in the summer breeze. Word spread through Hollow Creek faster than wildfire, carried from the general store to the church to the saloon by voices that grew more excited with each retelling. "Marriage auction," the poster proclaimed in letters large enough to be read from across the street. "By order of the Ransom Family Trust, and in accordance with territorial law, Mr. Beauregard Ransom will be available for marriage by public auction on Saturday, July 15th at 2:00 p.m. sharp. Minimum bid, $500. Auction to be held at the Hollow Creek Community Hall. All unmarried women of good standing welcome to participate." Mabeth discovered it while running errands for Mr. Henderson, her heart stopping as she read the words that reduced the man she loved to livestock for sale. Around her, townspeople gathered in excited clusters, their voices carrying speculation and gossip that made her stomach turn. $500 minimum, Mrs. Patterson was saying to a group of women from the church auxiliary. "That's more than most families see in a year, but for the Ransom Ranch." "Think of the oil rights alone," interrupted Susanna Whitmore. "They say there's enough black gold under that land to make whoever marries him richer than Midas himself." "Assuming they can stand to look at him," added her twin sister with a cruel laugh. "Though I suppose for that kind of money, a woman could learn to overlook quite a lot." Mabeth's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she forced herself to remain silent. Creating a scene would only give the gossips more ammunition, and Bo was already humiliated enough without her adding to the spectacle. She found him that afternoon sitting on his front porch with the auction notice crumpled in his lap, staring out at the fields with an expression of profound defeat. Belle grazed peacefully in the nearby paddock, unaware that her master's world was crumbling around him. "You've seen it then," he said, without looking up as she approached. "Half the town's talking about it." Mabeth settled into the chair beside him, noting the way his shoulders curved inward as if he were trying to make himself smaller. "How did this happen?" Bo smoothed out the wrinkled paper with careful hands, his scarred fingers tracing the official seal at the bottom. "Jeremiah filed a petition with the territorial court, claimed I was mentally incompetent to manage my own affairs due to," he gestured vaguely at his face, "due to traumatic disfigurement and subsequent social withdrawal. Said the only way to satisfy the trust requirements was through a court-supervised marriage auction." "That's barbaric," Mabeth breathed. "And surely illegal. A man can't be forced to marry simply because his cousin wants his land." "Apparently he can, if the cousin has enough legal precedent and a sympathetic judge." Bo's voice was hollow, drained of the warmth she'd grown to love. The territorial marriage laws were written in a different time, when arranged marriages and business partnerships were more common. Jeremiah found a loophole and drove a cattle drive through it. Mabeth studied his profile, seeing the shame there that cut deeper than any physical scar. "You don't have to go through with this. We could leave, go somewhere else, start fresh." "With what money? What prospects?" Bo shook his head. "And even if we could, running away would mean abandoning everything my family built. This ranch has been in ransom hands for 4 generations, Mabeth. I can't be the one who loses it to a technicality and a greedy cousin. So you'll let yourself be sold like a prize bull at market." The comparison made him flinch. "What choice do I have? At least this way, the ranch stays in family hands, even if I'm just—" He struggled for words. "Just a husband in name, only to whatever woman is desperate enough to bid on damaged goods." Mabeth felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. "Is that really what you think, that you're damaged goods?" "Look at me," Bo said, finally turning to face her fully. "Really look. Half my face is scarred, my voice sounds like I've been gargling gravel, and I've been hiding in this house for 3 years like a coward. What woman in her right mind would want that for a husband?" "I would," Mabeth said quietly. The words hung between them like a bridge neither quite dared to cross. Bo's blue eyes searched her face, looking for pity or obligation, but finding only steady determination. "Mabeth, I mean it," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I know we talked about this before, about what we might mean to each other, but this changes things. If you're going to be forced into marriage anyway, why shouldn't it be to someone who actually loves you?" Bo's expression softened, but pain shadowed his features. "Because you deserve better than to be the only option left to a desperate man. Because what we've built these past months, it's too precious to turn into a business transaction." "What if it doesn't have to be a business transaction?" Mabeth moved her chair closer, her hands reaching for his. "What if it could be 2 people who care about each other choosing to face the future together? Even if that future might never be," Bo struggled with the words, "even if I might never be able to give you a real marriage, children, passion, all the things a woman should have." Mabeth's heart ached at the doubt in his voice, the way years of isolation and self-hatred had convinced him he had nothing of value to offer. "Bo, do you think I've been coming here every day for months because I was hoping for passion? Do you think I fell in love with you because I was planning to change you into someone else?" "I don't know why you fell in love with me," he admitted, "but I know you deserve more than settling for a man who might never be whole again." "You are whole," Mabeth said fiercely. "You're scarred, yes. Changed, yes. But you're not broken, no matter what that auction notice tries to imply. You're the same man who risked his life to save Belle, who plays piano like an angel when he thinks no one's listening, who's shown me more kindness and respect than any so-called whole man ever has." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Jeremiah rode up the lane on a fine bay gelding, his expensive clothes and satisfied expression marking him as a man whose plans were proceeding exactly as he'd hoped. "Cousin," he called out as he dismounted, "I trust you've seen the announcement. Everything's arranged for Saturday afternoon. The hall's been reserved, the auctioneer hired." "Get off my land," Bo said, rising from his chair with quiet menace. Now. Jeremiah's smile never wavered. Now, Bo. There's no need for hostility. I'm only trying to help you comply with the court order. Though I must say, I'm curious to see how many bids you'll actually receive. The minimum is $500, but given the circumstances, I wonder if you'll even get that much interest. I said, get off my land. Oh, but it's not your land anymore, is it? Jeremiah's tone turned mocking. As of this morning, the court has placed the ranch in receivership pending the outcome of Saturday's auction. I'm the appointed administrator, which means I have every right to be here. The words hit Bo like physical blows. Mabeth watched his face go pale, saw his hands shake slightly as the full implications sank in. He was no longer master of his own home, no longer owner of the land his family had worked for generations. You can't do this, Mabeth said, standing to face Jeremiah. There must be some legal recourse. Miss Cullen, Jeremiah's voice dripped with false sympathy. I understand you have feelings for my cousin, but sentiment doesn't change the law. Bo will be married on Saturday to whoever places the highest bid, and the ranch will pass to his new wife's management. Of course, if you're serious about your attachment to him, you're welcome to participate in the bidding yourself. The challenge was unmistakable and cruel in its calculation. Jeremiah knew perfectly well that a seamstress could never raise $500, let alone compete with women who might have family money or business interests at stake. How much? Mabeth asked quietly. I'm sorry. How much would it take to win? Her voice was steady, but Bo could see the way her hands trembled. What should I expect the final bid to be? Jeremiah's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. Miss Cullen, surely you can't be serious. The bidding could go well over $1,000, possibly more if word of the oil survey spreads. A woman in your position could never hope to compete. Answer the question, Mabeth said firmly. What's your best estimate for the winning bid? For the first time since arriving, Jeremiah looked uncertain. $1,500, perhaps $2,000. But Miss Cullen, even if you could somehow raise such a sum, you must understand that this isn't some romantic fairy tale. This is a business transaction, pure and simple. I understand perfectly, Mabeth replied. Better than you might think. After Jeremiah left, Bo and Mabeth sat in silence on the porch, the weight of Saturday's auction pressing down on them like a coming storm. The marriage auction announcement lay between them, its official language reducing their future to a matter of dollars and cents. Mabeth, Bo said finally, you can't seriously be considering this, even if you could raise the money. I can raise it, she interrupted. Maybe not enough to win, but enough to try. How? She was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the fields where cattle had once grazed. My grandmother left me her jewelry when she died. Most of it's not worth much, but there's a diamond necklace that belonged to her grandmother. I've never had it appraised, but the stones are real and the setting is old European work. You can't sell your grandmother's jewelry for me, Bo protested. That's your inheritance, your security. My security? Mabeth laughed, but there was no humor in it. Bo, I'm a 28-year-old seamstress with a limp and no prospects beyond whatever I can earn with my needle. That necklace is beautiful, but it can't keep me warm at night or give me a purpose beyond mending other people's clothes. If selling it means I have a chance to build a life with the man I love, then it's the best investment I could possibly make. The marriage auction announcement fluttered in the evening breeze, its words a reminder that sometimes love had to fight for its right to exist. In 3 days, Mabeth would learn whether her heart was worth more than her bank account, and whether the man she loved was brave enough to believe he deserved to be chosen rather than simply purchased. The simple gold ring had belonged to Mabeth's mother, passed down from a woman who'd understood that love was not about perfection but about choosing to see beauty in unexpected places. Now it sat in Mabeth's palm as she stood before the mirror in her small apartment, its warm weight a reminder of the courage she would need to find in the next 24 hours. Friday morning had dawned grey and oppressive, with clouds gathering on the horizon like spectators waiting for tomorrow's spectacle. The entire town buzzed with excitement about the marriage auction, conversations stopping abruptly when Mabeth passed and resuming in whispers once she was out of earshot. She'd spent the morning at the bank, where the diamond necklace her grandmother had treasured had been appraised and sold, yielding $850 more than she'd dared hope. But possibly not enough to matter. "You don't have to do this," her reflection seemed to whisper back at her. The practical voice in her head that had kept her safe for 28 years was arguing against the madness of what she was contemplating. $850 was more money than she'd ever possessed at one time. It could buy her security, independence, a chance to start fresh somewhere else where nobody knew her as the town's limping seamstress. But then she thought of Beau's face when he'd spoken about damaged goods, about being sold like livestock, and her resolve hardened. He wasn't damaged goods. He was the kindest man she'd ever known, and if the rest of Hollow Creek couldn't see that, then they were fools who didn't deserve him. A knock at her door interrupted her reverie. She opened it to find Mrs. Patterson from the bakery, her expression uncharacteristically serious. "May I come in, dear?" the older woman asked. "We need to talk." Mabeth stepped aside, gesturing toward the small sitting area that comprised most of her modest living space. Mrs. Patterson settled herself with the careful movements of someone bearing uncomfortable news. "I've heard you're planning to participate tomorrow," Mrs. Patterson began without preamble. "Word travels fast in this town." "Too fast sometimes." Mrs. Patterson's weathered hands folded in her lap. "Mabeth, I need to tell you something, and I'm not sure how to make it easier to hear." A chill ran down Mabeth's spine. "What is it?" "There are women coming in from other towns, women with money, connections, business interests, the kind of women who see opportunity where others see tragedy." Mrs. Patterson's voice was gentle but firm. "Clara Whitfield arrived this morning from San Antonio with her father's money behind her. The Morrison widow came in on the afternoon stage with enough cash to buy half the county. And there are others women who've heard about the oil prospects and see Beau Ransom as an investment rather than a husband." Mabeth felt her heart sink, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. "How much are we talking about?" "Clara Whitfield's been bragging that she's prepared to bid up to $3,000. The Morrison widow has her late husband's life insurance money, $5,000 or more, if the rumors are true." "Mrs. Patterson reached across to touch Mabeth's hand. "Honey, whatever you've managed to scrape together, it won't be enough to compete with that kind of money." The words hit like physical blows, but Mabeth forced herself to remain composed. "I see. I'm not telling you this to be cruel, Mrs. Patterson continued. "I'm telling you because I care about you, and I don't want to see you humiliate yourself tomorrow. Some battles can't be won with good intentions." After Mrs. Patterson left, Mabeth sat alone in her apartment as afternoon shadows lengthened across the floor. The gold ring caught the fading light, and she found herself thinking about her mother's mariage jeunesse, perfect, certainly, but built on genuine affection and mutual respect. Her parents had chosen each other despite her father's modest circumstances and her mother's practical nature, proving that love didn't require wealth or beauty to flourish. But this wasn't about love, was it? Tomorrow's auction would be about money, pure and simple. The women coming from other towns didn't care about Beau's gentle hands or his rare smiles. They saw only the ranch, the oil rights, the financial opportunity that a scarred man's desperation represented. A second knock interrupted her brooding. This time it was Tom Henderson, hat in hand and expression apologetic. "Miss Cullen," he began, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but my father sent me to speak with you about tomorrow. If this is another attempt to talk me out of participating, actually, it's the opposite." Tom stepped inside when she gestured, his young face earnest with purpose. "My father and I have been talking, and we want you to know that you have our support. More than that, we want to help." Mabeth studied his face, looking for pity or condescension but finding only genuine concern. "Help how?" "The store's been good to our family for 20 years, and you've been good to us. Always fair, always helpful, never asking for more than you've earned." Tom reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded paper. "This is a promissory note for $2,000, backed by the store's assets. If you need additional funds for tomorrow, it's yours." Mabeth stared at the document, overwhelmed by the unexpected generosity. "Tom, I can't possibly accept this. If I lose tomorrow, how would I ever repay such a sum?" "You've been like family to us," Tom said simply, "and family helps family. Besides, my father says you've got more business sense in your little finger than most men have in their whole bodies. He thinks you and Mr. Ransom could make that ranch profitable again, given the chance." The offer was tempting beyond words, but Mabeth's practical nature rebelled against the idea of accepting such a massive debt. "What if the bidding goes higher than even this could cover?" "Then you'll know you tried everything possible," Tom replied. "But Miss Cullen, there's something else you should consider. This isn't just about winning an auction. It's about showing the whole county that Bo Ransom isn't the broken man his cousin wants everyone to believe he is, that someone values him enough to fight for him." After Tom left, Mabeth walked to her window and looked out at the town where she'd spent her entire life. Tomorrow, everything would change. Either she would become Mrs. Beauregard Ransom, mistress of a 15,000-acre ranch, or she would remain Mabeth Cullen, seamstress, with her heart broken and her savings depleted. But as evening fell, and she prepared for what might be her last night as a single woman, she realized that the outcome mattered less than the attempt itself. Bo needed to know that someone saw his worth, that someone was willing to fight for him when he'd forgotten how to fight for himself. She spent the evening preparing carefully, choosing her best dresser, simple blue cotton that brought out her eye sand, braiding her hair in a style her mother had taught her years ago. The gold ring went on her finger, a talisman of hope and determination. Meanwhile, across town, Bo sat alone in his empty house, staring at the official papers that had arrived that afternoon. The auction terms were laid out in merciless detail. He would present himself at the community hall at 2 o'clock sharp, where interested parties could examine him like livestock before the bidding began. The highest bidder would become his wife within the hour, with a territorial judge standing by to perform the ceremony. Belle's gentle whickering from the barn reminded him that some creatures still found him worthy of affection, but the sound only deepened his sense of isolation. Tomorrow he would be sold to a stranger who saw him as a business opportunity, and the woman he truly loved would be forced to watch it happen. He'd tried to convince Mabeth not to attend the auction at all, but she'd refused to even discuss the possibility. "I'll be there," she'd said firmly. "If you're going to go through this humiliation, you won't face it alone." The thought of her in that crowd, watching him be purchased by another woman, made his stomach turn. But he also knew better than to argue with Mabeth once her mind was made up. She had a strength that humbled him, a courage he was only beginning to understand. As midnight approached, Bo made his way to the piano and played his mother's favorite ballad one last time. The notes filled the empty house with bittersweet beauty, a farewell to the life he'd known and a prayer for whatever came next. The cracked key still caught under his finger, but tonight even that imperfection seemed to add something to the music, a reminder that beauty could exist alongside damage, that wholeness didn't require perfection. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, as if the weather were mocking the darkness of the day's events. Mabeth woke before sunrise, her stomach churning with nerves and determination in equal measure. She dressed carefully, pinning her mother's ring to the inside of her collar where she could feel its weight against her heart. The walk to the community hall felt like a march to execution, but she kept her head high and her steps steady. Other women were already gathering some she recognized from town, others clearly from elsewhere, all of them studying each other with the calculating gaze of competitors at a horse auction. Clara Whitfield stood near the front steps, resplendent in a burgundy silk dress that probably cost more than Mabeth earned in 6 months. She was undeniably beautiful, with golden hair and perfect features that spoke of good breeding and better nutrition. Beside her, the Morrison widow looked equally formidable in black mourning attire that somehow managed to be both respectful and alluring. These were the women Mabeth would be competing against, women with money, connections, and the kind of beauty that made men forget to breathe. Women who saw Beau's scars as a minor inconvenience that could be overlooked in exchange for mineral rights and social position. But as Mabeth took her place in the growing crowd, she reminded herself that she had something they didn't. She knew Beau Ransom not as a business opportunity, but as a man. She'd seen his gentleness with Belle, heard his music in the quiet evenings, watched him struggle with self-doubt, and slowly learned to trust again. The church bell struck noon, and Mabeth felt her mother's ring warm against her skin. In 2 hours, she would learn whether love could triumph over money, whether a seamstress with a limp could outbid the daughters of wealthy men. The auction that would determine Beau Ransom's future and her own was about to begin. The wooden bidding paddle felt smooth and foreign in Mabeth's gloved hands as she stood in the back of the crowded community hall, her heart beating so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. The number 47 was painted in bold black numerals across its surface, a signed identifier for what would either be the most important moment of her life or its most devastating failure. Around her, the hall buzzed with an energy that felt both festive and predatory. Women from 3 counties had gathered for the spectacle, some dressed in their finest silks, and others in practical traveling clothes that spoke of long journeys undertaken for business rather than romance. Men clustered near the bar that had been set up in one corner, their voices carrying speculation about oil rights and property values, while their wives examined the competition with calculating eyes. At exactly 2 o'clock, Jeremiah Ransom strode to the makeshift podium that had been erected at the front of the hall. He wore his finest suit and carried himself with the satisfaction of a man whose plans were unfolding exactly as intended. Behind him, the territorial judge sat at a small table with marriage documents already prepared, his official presence lending legal weight to what felt more like a carnival sideshow than a wedding ceremony. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jeremiah's voice carried easily across the crowded hall, "thank you for gathering today for this legal proceeding. As administrator of the Ransom Family Trust, I'm here to ensure that the terms of the will are properly fulfilled through the marriage of my cousin, Beauregard Ransom, to the highest qualified bidder." A murmur rippled through the crowd as all eyes turned toward the side door where Beau would soon appear. Mabeth felt her throat tighten with sympathy for what he must be enduring, the knowledge that he was about to be paraded before a crowd like livestock at market, his personal worth reduced to whatever price desperate women were willing to pay. "Before we begin," Jeremiah continued, "let me review the terms. The minimum acceptable bid is $500. The winner will become Mrs. Beauregard Ransom within the hour and will assume joint ownership of the 15,000-acre Ransom Ranch, including all mineral rights and future development opportunities. The marriage will be legally binding and cannot be dissolved without mutual consent of both parties." Clara Whitfield raised her paddle immediately. "What assurances do we have regarding the groom's cooperation in this arrangement?" Jeremiah's smile was coldly professional. "Mr. Ransom has agreed to honor the terms of the auction as a condition of maintaining any claim to his family's property. He will be a dutiful husband to whoever claims him today." The casual cruelty of the statement made Mabeth's hands clench around her paddle. They were discussing Beau as if he were property to be transferred, not a human being with feelings and dignity. "Now then," Jeremiah announced, "let me present the gentleman in question." The side door opened, and Beau entered the hall with the measured gait of a man walking to his own execution. He dressed in his finest clothesa black suit that had been tailored before the fire and now hung slightly loose on his diminished frame. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he'd shaved carefully, but nothing could disguise the scars that marked the right side of his face or the haunted expression in his blue eyes. A collective gasp ran through the assembled women as they got their first clear look at him. Some expressions showed pity, others calculation, and a few barely concealed revulsion. Mabeth felt her heart break a little more with each reaction, knowing that Beau was seeing the same responses and drawing his own painful conclusions. He moved to stand beside the podium, his hands clasped behind his back and his gaze fixed on a point somewhere above the crowd's heads. Only once did his eyes find hers across the packed hall, and in that brief moment, she saw such raw vulnerability that she had to grip her paddle tighter to keep from rushing to his side. "Ladies," Jeremiah announced with theatrical flourish, "I present Mr. Beauregard Ransomware Hero, landowner and eligible bachelor. The bidding will begin at $500. For a long moment, silence stretched across the hall. Mabeth could see women exchanging glances, each waiting for someone else to make the first move. The weight of that silence pressed down on Beau's shoulders, and she watched his jaw tighten as the seconds ticked by without a single raised paddle. Finally, a woman. Mabeth didn't recognize middle-aged and expensively dress-lifted her paddle with obvious reluctance. $500. "We have 500, called the auctioneer Jeremiah had hired. "Do I hear 600? Clara Whitfield's paddle went up immediately. 600. 7, came another voice from the middle of the crowd. 800, Clara called, her tone suggesting she was barely getting started. The bidding continued steadily, climbing past $1,000 as more women joined the competition. Mabeth watched the numbers rise with growing desperation, knowing that each increase put Beau further beyond her reach. At $1,500, only 3 bidders remained active: Clara Whitfield, the Morrison widow, and a severe-looking woman from Austin whose paddle bore the number 23. $1,600, Clara announced, her voice ringing with confidence. $1,700, the Morrison widow countered immediately. The woman from Austin raised her paddle. $2,000. A murmur of excitement ran through the crowd. $2,000 was serious money, more than most ranch hands would see in 5 years of hard work. Mabeth felt her palms grow damp inside her gloves as she realized the moment of decision was approaching. $2,100, Clara called, her golden hair catching the afternoon light streaming through the hall's windows. $22, the Morrison widow responded without hesitation. The woman from Austin hesitated, then shook her head and lowered her paddle. 2 bidders remained, and the price was climbing toward $3,000, far beyond anything Mabeth could hope to match, even with Tom Henderson's generous loan. $2,500, Clara announced, turning to smile at the Morrison widow with predatory satisfaction. For the first time, the widow hesitated. Mabeth could see her calculating, weighing the value of the ranch against the cost of acquisition. Finally, reluctantly, she raised her paddle. $2,600. $27, Clara shot back immediately. Another long pause from the Morrison widow. The hall held its collective breath, sensing that the auction was nearing its climax. Finally, with visible reluctance, the widow shook her head and lowered her paddle. "We have $2,700, the auctioneer called, going once." Mabeth's hand moved almost without her conscious decision, raising her paddle high above her head. $2,800, she called, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent hall. The effect was electric. Heads turned toward her with expressions of shock and disbelief. She heard someone whisper, "The seamstress," and saw Clara Whitfield's perfect features twist with surprise and disdain. But it was Beau's reaction that mattered most. His eyes found hers across the crowded hall, and in them she saw amazement, gratitude, and something that might have been hope warring with terror at what she was risking for his sake. Clara recovered quickly from her surprise. $3,000, she announced, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversation like a blade. Mabeth felt her heart sink. Even with Tom's loan, she couldn't match that bid. But she'd come this far, invested everything she had in this moment, and she wouldn't give up without exhausting every option. $3,100, she called, her voice steady despite the way her hands shook around the paddle. The hall erupted in excited whispers. This was no longer just an auction, it had become a battle between old money and true love, between calculation and courage. Every eye in the place moved between the 2 women, like spectators at a tennis match, waiting to see who would blink first. The hand-picked bouquet of wildflowers lay forgotten on the bench beside Mabeth, their simple beauty a stark contrast to the mercenary atmosphere that had overtaken the community hall. She'd gathered them that morning from the fields behind her apartment, Indian paintbrush, bluebonnets, and wild roses, thinking they might serve as her wedding bouquet if the impossible happened, and she somehow won the auction. Now, with Clara Whitfield's cold gaze fixed on her like a predator sizing up its prey, those flowers seemed like naive tokens of a dream that was crumbling before her eyes. $3,200, Clara announced, her voice carrying the casual confidence of someone accustomed to buying whatever she wanted. The silk of her burgundy dress rustled as she adjusted her position, every movement calculated to display her superiority over the plain seamstress who dared to challenge her. Mabeth felt the weight of the entire hall's attention pressing down on her. She could see the mathematics of defeat in the faces around Hirsch, was a woman with limited means fighting a battle that required unlimited resources. Even Tom Henderson's generous loan wouldn't be enough if Clara was determined to push the bidding higher. But as her gaze found Bose across the crowded room, she saw something that changed everything. He wasn't looking at her with pity or embarrassment at her futile gesture. Instead, his scarred features held an expression of such profound gratitude and love that it took her breath away. Win or lose, he understood what she was trying to do, what it meant for someone to value him enough to risk everything. "Going once," the auctioneer called. $3,200, going once. Mabeth raised her paddle with hands that no longer trembled. 3,300. A collective gasp ran through the hall. She was now bidding money she didn't have, couldn't hope to repay, but something deeper than financial logic was driving her forward. This wasn't just about winning an auction anymore. It was about proving that love could compete with greed, that a man's worth couldn't be measured solely in dollars and cents. Clara's perfect composure cracked slightly, her eyes narrowing as she reassessed her competition. 3,400, she snapped, her voice carrying an edge of irritation. 35. Mabeth responded immediately, not allowing herself time to think about the impossibility of what she was promising. The hall buzzed with excitement as spectators realized they were witnessing something unprecedented, to battle between two women that had transcended mere financial calculation and become a contest of will and determination. "This is ridiculous," Clara said loudly enough for half the hall to hear. "Does that woman even have access to such funds? Shouldn't there be some verification of ability to pay?" Jeremiah, who had been watching the proceedings with growing unease, stepped forward. "Miss Whitfield raises a valid point. Miss Cullen, can you provide assurance that you have the means to honor your bid?" All eyes turned to Mabeth, and she felt the crushing weight of exposure. She could lie, bluff her way through this moment, and worry about the consequences later. Or she could tell the truth and watch her chance slip away forever. Before she could answer, a familiar voice spoke from the back of the hall. "I can provide that assurance." Tom Henderson stepped forward, his young face set with determination. "Miss Cullen has access to a line of credit backed by Henderson's dry goods. Her bid is legitimate." "And how much credit are we talking about?" Clara demanded, clearly frustrated by this unexpected complication. "Enough," Tom replied simply. "More than enough to cover any reasonable bid." Clara's face flushed with anger. She'd come to Hollow Creek expecting an easy acquisition, only to find herself in a genuine competition with a woman she'd dismissed as irrelevant. $4,000, she announced, her voice sharp with determination. The figure hung in the air like a challenge. $4,000 was a fortune more than most people in Hollow Creek would see in a lifetime of hard work. Mabeth felt the practical part of her mind reeling at the impossibility of such a sum. But then she noticed something that sent a chill through her heart. Clara wasn't looking at the auctioneer or at Beau. She was looking at Jeremiah, and there was something in that exchange of glances that spoke of prior arrangement, of plans made in advance of this supposedly open auction. "Going once for $4,000, the auctioneer called. "Do I hear?" $4,001, Mabeth said quietly. The specificity of the bid caught everyone off guard. In a contest of thousands, why add a single dollar? But Mabeth had her reasons. She was making a point about the difference between buying something and truly valuing it. Clara's composure finally cracked completely. This is absurd. You can't possibly have $4,000. You're a seamstress, for God's sake. And you're a woman who thinks love can be purchased like a dress from a catalogue, Mabeth replied, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent hall. The difference is, I know what Mr. Ransom is actually worth. The insult struck home. Clara's beautiful features twisted with rage as she realized she was being challenged, not just financially but morally, her motives exposed before the entire community. $5,000, Clara snarled, and I want to see proof of funds before any more ridiculous bids are accepted. The hall fell silent except for the sound of shifting bodies and nervous whispers. $5,000 was beyond anything Mabeth could possibly manage, even with Tom's help. She looked across the room at Beau, seeing the resignation settling over his features like a shroud. But then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Patterson from the bakery stood up in the middle of the crowd, her flour-dusted apron incongruous in the formal setting. "I'll back Miss Cullen's bid," she announced in her firm, no-nonsense voice, "whatever amount she needs." Old Pete rose from his seat near the back. "So will I. The girl's got more courage than the rest of us combined." One by one, other voices joined the chorus. The blacksmith, the doctor, the preacher's wife, people who had watched Mabeth give quietly and generously to their community for years, were now standing up to support her in return. "This is highly irregular," Jeremiah protested, but his voice lacked conviction. The community's show of support for Mabeth was changing the dynamics of the auction in ways he hadn't anticipated. Clara looked around the hall with growing panic, realizing that she wasn't just bidding against one woman anymore, but against an entire town that had chosen its champion. $5,001, Mabeth said, her voice ringing with new confidence. 6,000, Clara shot back desperately. 6,001. 7,001. The pattern continued, Clara's bids growing more frantic, while Mabeth remained steady and sure. With each exchange, it became clearer that Clara was fighting a battle she couldn't win, not because she lacked money, but because she was fighting against something money couldn't purchase. Finally, at $8,000, Clara's nerve broke. "This is insane," she declared, throwing down her paddle. "The man isn't worth bankrupting myself over." The words rang across the silent hall, laying bare the calculating nature of her interest in Beau. She'd come seeking a business opportunity and found herself in a contest of the harder battle. She was fundamentally unprepared to fight. "Going once," the auctioneer called. $8,001, going once, going twice. Mabeth held her breath, scarcely believing that the impossible was about to become reality. "Sold!" The auctioneer's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "To bidder number 47 for $8,001. The hall erupted in cheers and applause as the community celebrated their seamstress's unlikely victory. But Mabeth had eyes only for Beau, who was pushing through the crowd toward her with an expression of wonder and disbelief. When he reached her, they stood facing each other in the midst of the celebrating crowd, both too overwhelmed for words. Finally, Beau reached out to touch her face with gentle fingers, his scarred features soft with emotion. "You fought for me," he said, his rough voice barely audible above the noise around them. "Of course I did," Mabeth replied, picking up her forgotten bouquet of wildflowers. "You're worth fighting for." The territorial judge was already calling them forward to complete the marriage ceremony, but for this moment, they existed in a bubble of quiet joy, surrounded by the chaos of their victory. The auction was over, but their real life together was just beginning. 6 months later, the restored family portrait hung in the place of honor above the piano in the Ransom Ranch house parlor, its gold frame catching the warm light of the late afternoon sun. But it wasn't the formal painting of Beau's grandparents that commanded attention anymore. It was the new photograph beside it, showing Beau and Maybeth on their wedding day, her wildflower bouquet bright against her simple blue dress, his scarred face radiant with genuine happiness. The house itself had undergone its own transformation. Fresh paint brightened the shutters, the front porch had been rebuilt with sturdy new railings, and Maybeth's flower garden bloomed in carefully tended beds that rivaled anything his mother had ever grown. But the changes went deeper than mere decoration. The house felt alive again, filled with the sound of conversation and laughter, piano music in the evenings, and the comfortable rhythm of two people building a life together. Beau stood at the kitchen window, watching his wife hang laundry on the line they'd strung between two oak trees, her movements graceful despite her limp, her face peaceful in the golden autumn light. She'd kept her promise to make the ranch profitable again, applying her practical mind to problems that had seemed insurmountable when he'd faced them alone. The cattle were back, a small herd to start, purchased with careful investment of the oil lease money that had begun flowing once Jeremiah's claims were settled in court. The fields would be planted again come spring, and they'd hired back two of the ranch hands who'd worked for Beau's father. "She's quite something, isn't she?" Tom Henderson's voice came from behind him, accompanied by the sound of boots on the wooden floor. He'd stopped by to discuss the expansion of Maybeth's seamstress business. What had started as mending and alterations was growing into a thriving enterprise, creating custom clothing for wealthy families in 3 counties. "That she is," Beau agreed, turning to shake hands with a young man who'd become not just a business partner, but a true friend. "How did the meeting with the banker go?" "Better than expected. He's agreed to the loan terms for the new shop building, especially after I showed him the order books." "Maybeth's reputation is spreading faster than we can keep up with," Tom grinned, "though I suspect that's not the only reputation that's growing around here." Beau raised an eyebrow in question, and Tom's grin widened. "Word's gotten out about how you handled those cattle rustlers last month. The scarred sheriff. They're calling you in Abilene. Seems your war experience and natural leadership are exactly what this county needs in a lawman." The rustlers had been a test. Beau hadn't expected a band of outlaws who'd thought the isolated Ransom Ranch would be easy pickings. They'd discovered their mistake when Beau organized the neighboring ranchers into a coordinated response that captured the entire gang without a shot being fired. His tactical thinking and calm authority under pressure had impressed everyone involved, leading to offers of employment he was still considering. "I haven't decided about the sheriff position," Beau said, though he was clearly tempted by the idea of serving his community in such a capacity. "Maybeth thinks you should take it," Tom observed. "Said this county could use a sheriff who understands that real strength comes from protecting others, not intimidating them." Through the window, Beau watched his wife finish hanging the last shirt and turned toward the house, her face lighting up when she spotted him watching. She waved, a gesture so natural and unconscious that it made his heart skip, just as it had on their wedding day. The wedding itself had been a small affair, just the territorial judge, a handful of close friends, and Maybeth's wildflower bouquet. Clara Whitfield had left town immediately after the auction, her tail between her legs and her pride severely wounded. Jeremiah had tried to contest the marriage's validity, but his legal challenges had crumbled when the community rallied behind the new couple with testimonials about their genuine affection and shared commitment to the ranch's future. The oil money had solved their immediate financial problems, but it was Maybeth's business acumen and Beau's returning confidence that had built something sustainable. They'd proven that the ranch could be profitable through traditional mean-scattle, crops, and careful management, rather than depending solely on mineral extraction. "Speaking of Maybeth," Tom said, "she asked me to remind you about dinner tonight, something about wanting to discuss plans for the future." Beau nodded, though he wondered what plans his wife had in mind. They'd already talked about expanding the cattle operation, maybe adding sheep, and certainly improving the breeding program with Belle's eventual offspring. The mare was pregnant again, this time with a foal that promised to be the start of a new bloodline. Maybeth entered the kitchen with a basket of fresh eggs from their expanding chicken coop, her cheeks pink from the cool autumn air. She kissed Beau's scarred cheek, without hesitation, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the past 6 months. "Tom, perfect timing," she said, setting down the egg basket. "I wanted to thank you again for the loan references. The new workshop should be ready by Christmas." "It's good business," Tom replied, though his affection for both of them was obvious. "Besides, someone has to keep you two from taking over the entire county economy." After Tom left, Beau and Mabeth worked together preparing dinner, their movements synchronized by months of shared domestic routine. Beau had discovered he actually enjoyed cooking. It was precise work that yielded tangible results, not unlike the ranch management skills he was relearning. "You seem thoughtful today," Mabeth observed as she set the table with the good china they'd started using for everyday meals. "Life was too short," she'd declared, "to save the best things for special occasions." "Tom mentioned you wanted to discuss plans for the future," Beau said, testing the biscuits in the oven. "What did you have in mind?" Mabeth's smile held a secret that made her eyes sparkle. "Well, we've been talking about expanding our operations, adding to the livestock, maybe hiring more help." "All of which sounds reasonable," Beau agreed, wondering where this was leading. "I was thinking we might need to start planning for a larger household," Mabeth continued, her voice carefully casual. "Maybe converting one of the upstairs rooms into a nursery." Beau's hand stilled on the oven door as the implications of her words sank in. He turned to face her, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. "Mabeth, are you saying—" "I'm saying we're going to need that nursery sooner rather than later," she confirmed, her smile widening at his stunned expression. "Dr. Morrison confirmed it yesterday. We're having a baby, Beau." The news hit him like a physical blow, but instead of pain, it brought pure joy. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and swept her into his arms, spinning her around while she laughed with delight. "Are you sure?" he asked when he finally set her down, his hands cupping her face with infinite gentleness. "Quite sure," she replied, leaning into his touch. "Though I suspect the whole county will know soon enough, given how quickly news travels around here." Beau thought about their child growing up on this ranch, running through the same fields where he'd played as a boy, learning to ride on Belle's future offspring, carrying on the Ransom name with pride rather than burden. The family legacy he'd thought lost forever would continue, but better than before, built on genuine love rather than obligation, strengthened by the understanding that real worth came from character rather than appearance. As evening fell, they sat together on the front porch that Beau had rebuilt with his own hands, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Belle grazed peacefully in the nearby paddock, her own pregnancy showing in the gentle roundness of her sides. The whole ranch seemed to hum with the quiet satisfaction of life renewing itself. "Do you ever regret it?" Beau asked, his arm around Mabeth as she leaned against his shoulder. "The auction, the money you spent, choosing me over a safer future?" Mabeth was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "I regret that it was necessary," she said finally. "I regret that people like your cousin exist, that money talks louder than love in too many situations. But choosing you, fighting for us, never. Even knowing what our children might face, the stares, the whispers about their father's scars. Our children will be raised to understand that scars tell stories of survival, not shame," Mabeth said firmly. "They'll know that their father is a hero who saved a horse from a burning barn, who rebuilt his life from nothing, who had the courage to love again despite being wounded. And they'll be proud of that heritage." The piano music that drifted through the open windows was no longer tentative or melancholy. Beau had been playing again regularly, his confidence returning along with his joy, and now Mabeth often joined him in the evenings, her clear voice harmonizing with the melody in songs that spoke of hope and enduring love. The cracked key had been repaired months ago, but sometimes Beau still played around it out of habit, a reminder that imperfection didn't diminish beauty. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Mabeth placed her hand on her still flat stomach, imagining the life growing therein, child who would know from birth that they were wanted, planned for, celebrated. This baby would never doubt their worth or question their place in the world, because they would be raised by parents who understood that love wasn't about perfection but about choosing each other every single day. "I've been thinking about names," she said, her voice soft in the gathering darkness. "Already?" Bo chuckled, his scarred face creasing with genuine amusement. "We've known for all of 2 hours. A woman can't start too early with these things." Mabeth replied with mock seriousness. "For a boy, I was thinking of your father's name, James, and for a girl, maybe Rose, after your mother's favorite flowers." Bo felt his throat tighten with emotion. His parents had died, believing their son would never marry, never carry on the family name, never give them grandchildren to spoil and love. But somehow, impossibly, that future had found its way back to him through the courage of a limping seamstress who'd seen past his scars to his soul. "They would have loved you," he said quietly. "My parents. They would have seen what I see, that you're exactly what this family needed to heal." "We healed each other," Mabeth corrected gently. "That's what love does. It doesn't fix people, but it gives them reasons to fix themselves." In the distance, they could hear the church bells of Hollow Creek marking the hour, the same bells that had rung the night of the fire 3 years ago. But tonight the sound carried no urgency or fear, only the peaceful rhythm of a community settling into evening rest. The town that had once whispered about the scarred hermit and the limping seamstress now spoke of them with pride, the couple who'd proven that love could triumph over circumstance, that worth wasn't measured in perfection but in the willingness to keep trying. The Ransom Ranch was thriving again, not just financially but spiritually. It had become a place where healing happened, where second chances bloomed like Mabeth's carefully tended roses. Neighbors stopped by regularly, not out of obligation or pity, but because the house had regained its reputation as a center of warmth and hospitality. Sunday dinners often featured a dozen guests, the long dining room table finally serving its intended purpose as a gathering place for family and friends. "Sheriff Ransom," Mabeth said suddenly, trying out the title. "It has a nice ring to it." "I haven't accepted the position yet," Bo protested, though his tone suggested he was weakening. "You will," she said with the quiet confidence of a wife who knew her husband's heart. "Because this county needs someone who understands that real authority comes from service, not power. Someone who's learned that the strongest people are often those who've been broken and chose to heal." As they prepared to go inside, Bo caught sight of their reflection in the window. Glasser-scarred man and a limping woman, their arms around each other, their faces peaceful with contentment. It wasn't the fairy tale ending he'd once imagined for himself, but it was something better. It was real, earned through struggle and sacrifice, built on a foundation strong enough to last a lifetime. The restored family portrait in the parlor would soon be joined by others' photographs of their children, grandchildren, the generations that would carry the Ransom name forward with pride rather than burden. But tonight, as they climbed the stairs to the bedroom they shared, Bo and Mabeth carried with them the knowledge that they'd already achieved the most important victory. They'd chosen love over fear, hope over despair, and each other over all the easier paths that life had offered. Behind them, Belle's gentle wicker carried on the night breeze, a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful things in life came from the deepest struggles. The mare who'd lost her first foal in the fire was now carrying new life, just as the man who'd thought himself unworthy of love had found his way back to joy through the courage of a woman who'd refused to let him face his demons alone. In the months and years to come, the story of their unlikely courtship would become legend in Hollow Creek, the tale of a marriage auction that became a love story, of two wounded souls who'd found healing in each other's arms. Children would grow up hearing about the seamstress who'd outbid wealthy women for the hand of the scarred cowboy, and lovers would make pilgrimages to see the ranch where true love had triumphed over circumstance. But tonight, they were simply Bo and Mabeth Ransom, husband and wife, expecting their first child and looking forward to a future bright with possibility. The auction that had brought them together was already fading into memory, replaced by the daily reality of shared laughter, mutual support, and the kind of deep contentment that came from knowing they'd found their home in each other's hearts.